Hello, 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 and welcome to Carol's Closet, where I, Carol, sit in my closet and I tell you about things that I have found particularly interesting. So, you might be wondering for today, what's today's topic? Well, if you look behind me, there are some darker colors in the closet today than per usual. And you know what that means? That means today we will be talking about topics that have a darker subject matter. Now, we're not talking about anything too gory. I would like to sleep at night. So, yeah. But we will be talking about um death, particularly in, you know, war. Um Death, funerals, the funeral industry, embalming, all that kind of stuff. So, if that's not for you, I'm so sorry. Um have a great day. Click off this video. But if that is for you, um welcome to the show. Today, we will be talking about the evolution of the American funeral, if that wasn't evident by the title at all. But so we will be talking about the evolution of the American funeral from World War One to World War Two to the Cold War. And by Cold War, since the Cold War had no physical battles, the Vietnam and Korean War specifically, and then to today. So, sit back, relax, hopefully not in a closet like me. And let's dive into it. So, when we talk about death and war, when we talk about specifically fallen soldiers, one of the questions is always, well, how do we get them home? How do we get them home to their families? And you might see in movies, when they knock on your door and they're like, hey, so and so has died in battle on this date, whatever, whatever. And typically, a whole funeral typically follows after that. But what happens before? How do we get them from, obviously, place and point of death to back home with their families? Well, luckily for you, the American military has come up with a solution for this. So, 1917, around the first few months after the U.S. joined World War I, they found this organization specifically tailored to bringing people home. And these people are called mortuary affair specialists. Now, what do these people do? They are trained specifically to go out onto the battlefield, retrieve dead bodies, bring them back, obviously do an autopsy once they're in safe hands, and send them home. And once they are sent home, typically it takes about a couple days to a week to get them properly back home and return them to their families. But now that we've kind of gone over the basics of how we get these soldiers home, we need to bring it all the way back if we want to start talking about funerals and how they've evolved. We're going to go back to the war that was supposed to end all wars, World War One. Welcome to World War One, aka the Great War, aka the war to end all wars. Quite obviously, due to its name, it is not the war to end all wars. But it was kind of one of the first instances of worldwide conflict that specifically the US was a part of. Obviously, we had a very high death toll on the American side of World War One. And again, families were like, well, I want my son, my brother, my father, whatever, I want to bring him home, lay him to rest. Now, typically during the previous American wars, like the Civil War, bodies are exhumed and they're brought home to their families. But after World War One, the Allies were not very fond of this concept, and there was a very long fight to get these men home from war. And in around late 1919, 1920, soldiers next of kin were finally identified, and they were given the choice to either A, bring them home, or B, bury them in a specific American military cemeteries throughout Europe. And once these men are brought home, we can see through the funerals that they have at home that we are still following very Victorian model of mourning because, as America likes to do, we copy things. So, Victorian era, we borrow from the British, and it goes on a little longer than it did in Europe. In Europe, it lasted around up until the 1890s, very early 1900s. But in America, it lasted until around mid 1910s, around that time, until just about like after the First World War, where we see a lot of these funerals. But many of these funerals, people wear black, typical mourning clothing that you see today, but it's very modest. It's very, everything is covered. Wives in particular, they mourn for a couple of years before remarrying. Men wear an armband for a couple months and then they can remarry. That's a separate topic. But we can kind of see the birth of media affecting these funerals because newspapers, which are not relatively new, but they're still like everybody's reading them, whereas today they've kind of fade into obscurity. But newspapers start publishing death notices, obituaries, as people have found, like in newspapers when they look for family trees, are published in newspapers. Funerals are typically held in a church, um, um, especially during this time when the country was mostly religious. The church is a typical place where you would hold a funeral. Now, this was slightly different in the wake of the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, where there were laws that you could not have a public gathering, so many of these wakes and things were held at home. We also see, after the First World War, specifically in America, but also throughout other places in Europe, we see this growth of kind of the political cult of the dead. Now, the political cult of the dead is a very specific way of how these fallen soldiers are viewed. So we see this kind of distinction between the private body and the political body. Now, the private body is the physical corpse. The physical corpse is buried typically in a cemetery, as cremation is not popular yet, although early stages are starting to develop. When these soldiers are buried in these cemeteries, it is typically a private cemetery with a family plot where their ancestors are buried as well. So that is completely private. Typically, the only visitors are family members and friends who obviously have come to mourn privately. Now, the political aspect of that is we see that the government and authorities typically focus on soldiers. They focus on the soldier deaths before civilian deaths. Of the dead, we see that soldiers' deaths are typically justified as this was a worthy sacrifice. They fought for our country, and in most cases, like in the US's case with World War One, we won that war. So their death is justified because they fought for our country and they helped defend our freedoms, they helped defend democracy, and things like that. So instead of a private gravestone for a specific soldier, typically for the political body, a monument is erected, like in public parks, in spaces. There are monuments specifically to the war effort. Now, they will list soldiers by name, but these are typically open to public visitors. Anybody can visit, anybody can see them. A quote from this article says that, quote, memorials should preserve a memory of an idea. Gravestones merely the memory of a person. And that kind of exemplifies what the political cult of the dead means, in the sense that the private body, the gravestone, is a person's life. This person had a family, they had events in their life, they had all these different things, they had hopes, dreams, and fears. But the government and the general public do not know that person. Gravestones are a extremely private affair, typically for family and friends that know the person, because the concept of mourning, specifically in this era before the turn of the century and before the mid 20th century, mourning is fairly private. Wives that are mourning their husbands often don't go out. They don't leave their homes for a period of time. And in Victorian England, they don't leave their homes for 2 years. Yes, this is a little bit of uh, backtracking, but that's just to prove how private this mourning aspect was, to respect the dead in a twisted sort of sense. And memorials, rather, are sort of a commemoration. They are saying, hey, this happened, and these people fought and lost their lives for a good cause. They fought and they died so that we could win this war and we could uphold these values that we find so near and dear to our hearts. Uh, but as time goes on, we see rises in new practices, as we typically do, and we see how mourning shifts and changes the American funeral in World War II. And now we move on to World War II. Now, World War II, we see a rise in a lot of different technologies, particularly in the funeral industry. But first, we'll start with, as typical, body recovery. So, after World War II, the military starts a 6-year recovery effort to find the American dead. It is still a choice for American families next of kin, whether they want to bring them home or bury them still in specialized American military cemeteries. If they can find the bodies, of course, there are cases where bodies cannot be found. For those that are brought home and they are given funerals, we see this kind of rise in personalized funerals. Now, funerals are still very religious, as the typical funeral still may happen in a church. However, we are seeing with this, as time passes, we are seeing the growth of funeral homes. Now, funeral homes have existed since around the late 1880s or so, and we see that mostly these are family owned. We don't really see a trend in chain funeral homes up until the modern day. So, in this time, most of these funeral homes are family owned and community based, and they start employing more practices. So, they start finding embalming specialists, which is the art of preserving a body. So, making sure that in the cases that an open casket viewing is going to happen, that the body doesn't look like a body. It doesn't look like a body. It looks like a person who is simply just sleeping. Now, sometimes that isn't always the case, but with the evolution of embalming, this becomes easier to do. There are more open casket funerals for people that want to see their loved ones. And funeral homes also employ other different practices like wakes for those that aren't specifically religious, or they would like to hold a separate for close family in a church and then for more general things in somewhere else. There are physical brick and mortar buildings for many of these funeral homes where they hold wakes, which, if you've never been to a funeral before, that's okay. A wake is sort of a viewing of the body for anybody who wants to, see the body, pay last respects, and things like that. They start offering gravesite maintenance, like, oh, we will make sure that plants don't grow, or like the headstone stays clean. And typically that requires that there is a partnership between the funeral home itself and the cemetery. and typically those are very like close by with each other. Again, you see more of this shift from private emotion to public emotion, where people are not mourning as much in private. Mourning is still a very private affair, but mourning starts shifting away from in your home with those that are close to you into more of a community outreach thing where you are reaching out to those around you in your communities for comfort, like seeking out friends and seeking out um, people to speak to. Not, we are not at the point of therapists, although therapy and psychology has started to grow around this point. We do not see a very large uptick in counseling, grief counseling yet. Uh, that is to come. And now we move on to World War II. Now, World War II, we see a rise in a lot of different technologies, particularly in the funeral industry. But first, we'll start with, as typical, body recovery. So, after World War II, the military starts a 6-year recovery effort to find the American dead. It is still a choice for American families next of kin whether they want to bring them home or bury them still in specialized American military cemeteries. If they can find the bodies, of course, there are cases where bodies cannot be found, and those that are brought home and they are given funerals, we see this kind of rise in less personalized funerals. Now, funerals are still very religious, as the typical funeral still may happen in a church, as the typical funeral still may happen in a church. However, we are seeing with this, as time passes, we are seeing the growth of funeral homes. Now, funeral homes have existed since around the late 1880s or so, and we see that mostly these are family owned. We don't really see a trend in chain funeral homes up until the modern day. So, in this time, most of these funeral homes are family owned and community based, and they start employing more practices. So, they start finding embalming specialists, which is the art of preserving a body. So, making sure that in the cases that an open casket viewing is going to happen, that the body doesn't look like well, a body. It doesn't look like a body. It looks like a person who is simply just sleeping. Now, sometimes that isn't always the case, but with the evolution of embalming, this becomes easier to do. There are more open casket funerals for people that want to see their loved ones. Funeral homes also employ other different practices like wakes for those that aren't specifically religious or they would like to hold a separate for close family in a church and then for more general things in somewhere else. There are physical brick and mortar buildings for many of these funeral homes where they hold wakes, which, if you've never been to a funeral before, that's okay. A wake isn't exactly. A wake is sort of a viewing of the body for anybody who wants to, see the body, pay last respects, and things like that. Um, they start offering gravesite maintenance, like, oh, we will make sure that plants don't grow, or like the headstone stays clean. And typically that requires that there is a partnership between the funeral home itself and the cemetery. And typically those are very like close by with each other. Again, you see more of this shift from private emotion to public emotion, where people are not mourning as much in private. Mourning is still a very private affair, but mourning starts shifting away from in your home with those that are close to you into more of a community outreach thing where you are reaching out to those around you in your communities for comfort, like seeking out friends and seeking out um, people to speak to. No, we are not at the point of therapists, although therapy and psychology has started to grow around this point. We do not see a very large uptick in counseling, grief counseling yet. Uh, that is to come extremely later. But still, the very primary source of where these fallen soldiers go, again, are in cemeteries. Excuse me. And we see still this propagation of the political cult of the dead. We see these monuments being created and mostly honored to justify these soldiers' deaths by saying, well, again, in the US's case, we won the war. So these people, they fought for us. Whereas these gravestones and these cemeteries are really just for private mourning, or any semblance of private mourning that still exists. And with the growth of these funeral homes, we see less and less home wakes that we saw around the time of the Spanish flu epidemic. Now, during the Spanish flu epidemic, those were not out of choice, these home wakes. They were more out of necessity. If you wanted a wake, it would have to be at your home and with limited people because of the whole pandemic thing that was going around. But we see as time goes forward, especially in World War II and onward, we see that more funeral homes are hosting these wakes rather than hosting them at home, kind of to create more of a separation between life and death, between where you are living and having your meals and your family gatherings and things like that, to a topic as serious as death. And as time continues to move forward, we move forward to the Cold War. And with the Cold War, specifically in the Cold War, we don't necessarily see any physical fighting, hence the name Cold War. Most of that was through Black Ops operations. Most deaths directly from the Cold War. So instead of focusing on the Cold War as a whole, we'll kind of be touching on both the Vietnam War and the Korean War, as well as going into more of the evolution of how funerals are run at home. So, firstly, with the and we'll start with the Korean War. Now, the Korean War, it was extremely cold. It was extremely cold, to be frank. Um, and actually, hold on. Now, something different that happened with the Vietnam War and the Korean War is that being buried overseas for American soldiers was no longer a choice. The military had started with their mortuary affairs specialists, that American dead would no longer be buried overseas. They would be brought home to their families as long as a body was present and as long as resources were available. And in most cases, they were. So, specifically in the Korean War, due to the fast changing battle lines, as constantly seen in a map of the Korean War, you see that constantly battle lines are changing. Battle lines are moving forward, moving backward. Things change fast in war, specifically this one. And these fast changing battle lines means that the dead don't really have time to sit in these areas because constantly they are moving. So the dead are immediately carried home from the front and shipped home. And the climate of Korea, specifically a lot during the war, was very, very cold. So it was very easy to bring these bodies home because it was not hard to bring these bodies home if they are frozen. But then we also see a rise in cases of frostbite and things like that where soldiers are dying because it is cold. And then it is a harder practice for embalmers when they get home because of the damage that frostbite has done to their bodies. But on the flip side, in the Vietnam War, the same practice is still used. To be frank, the mortuary affairs specialists are still specifically trained to fetch these soldiers and bring them from point A to point B and back home. And around this time, it takes them at least a week. We don't see any kind of instances where it takes longer than a week, but it has not reached the point where it has today, where they can come home in a couple of days. It takes about a week, as they are typically flown. That was a terrible visual. I am so sorry. um, but on the contrast of Vietnam and of Korea, Vietnam was extremely hot. So a lot of different measures were put in place that were converse to those happening in the Korean War. Because these wars were very close together, so a lot of the methods were carried over in the case of the methods of bringing them home and whatnot. But with the different climate, it was harder to preserve these bodies because of the heat, which encourages decomposition of the bodies. So it was, again, a lot harder for embalmers to properly reconstruct the body. Embalmers found it very difficult because compared to the Korean War, where a lot of these bodies were, despite other damage, of course, by their cause of death, typically they were relatively well preserved because of the cold temperature, whereas bodies coming from Vietnam are slightly different because of the extremely hot temperature. So the rate of decomposition is slightly faster in warmer environments. So it was harder to try and curb that rate because they are preserved on the way home best as possible on a plane, but trying to get to those bodies and get them back before a lot of that decomposition can happen was a particular challenge for the mortuary affairs specialists. Now, back at home, we can see throughout this time that cremations start to rise in popularity. Now, cremation used since the late 1800s, specifically 1876, was when we see the first usage of cremation in the US. However, starting in the 60s and going onward, we can kind of see this uptick in choosing to have your body cremated rather than burying them in the ground. Partly due to money costs, as it is less money to pay for an embalmer, a coffin, and other services like grave maintenance, rather than just paying for the cremation itself, an urn, or other trinkets, but typically an urn, and bringing that home. So we see this rise in cremations and kind of this fall of burials still. But burials are still extremely popular, and funeral homes are still doing extremely well for themselves in this period of time. As war, there are always deaths. But we do see, as time goes on, we see less religious funerals. Because while religion is still a very big aspect in America, specifically as a country that is majority Christian, especially as we get closer to the end of the Cold War, we see this rise in more agnostic and atheist population, as well as just people that don't necessarily want to hold a funeral or a wake in a church. So those that get buried are often, the wake and funeral are hosted at the funeral home, rather than having one service at the funeral home and one service at the church, kind of to cut costs and save more time and, for lack of a better phrase, get it over with quicker. So there is that. Embalming still rises in popularity. We see that funeral homes still continue to offer many of these services, and we see that embalming becomes particularly more advanced. We see more in-depth reconstructions of the face, the hair, the eyes, in ways to make sure that the body does not look like an actively decomposing corpse. Now, as we can see, throughout the Cold War, these funeral homes are still doing fairly well for themselves. But as time goes on and we move into today, this changes. During this time, and we see this a little bit in World War II, but during this time we see a complete shift from private mourning to public mourning. No longer are you mourning solely in the comfort of your own home, surrounded by maybe immediate family and maybe like one friend, but you are kind of seeing more of a community outreach things. You see in the growth of television around. We see in the growth of funerals that are now not only put in newspapers, but in the case of famous individuals, are placed on television. And we kind of see these specifically televised funerals with very public figures. Like, for example, JFK's funeral in 1963. Lots of these famous individuals, or at least people held, or people that are very well known and of course very well off, are put on television for the public to see. And we kind of see a little bit of this public mourning in the past as well. We see it in Lincoln, when Lincoln was assassinated, when his body was brought around the US for people to say goodbye to. But we see it on a wider scale once the introduction of television comes about, where these funerals are no longer a relatively private endeavor. Because, yes, with the rising growth of funeral homes and the rising community outreach that comes with mourning now, funerals were not televised. The most that you could find about a funeral was likely in a newspaper. And even those were like strictly limited to a guest list. Well, technically, funerals don't really necessarily have guest lists. That really depends upon who's hosting the funeral. But with the rise of television, anybody can watch your funeral if you are incredibly important. And you are deemed, for lack of a better term, worthy of having a public funeral, where anybody can tune in and watch you. Well, past tense, you are dead, but you and your family and your friends mourning you. And that is a public display of this mourning, these mourning practices. And it kind of brings up the argument of whether is mourning, once funerals are publicized, is mourning really private anymore at all, with the concept of surveillance and being watched while you're mourning? How much are you mourning for real, and how much is being held back or is acting for a camera? But that is a separate and completely moral argument that I don't simply have the time to go into right now. But this rise in publicized funerals has changed how we view mourning. And that really just, comes into today. And so we've reached the end of the timeline. Welcome to today, the 21st century. What a century, Okay, I'm gonna cut all of that. That's fine. And so welcome to the 21st century, aka the century that we live in. Welcome to today and the future of tomorrow. So the American funeral has changed in a lot of ways today. Now, black is still a typical mourning color that people still wear for funerals out of respect, but it is not, well, for lack of a better term, mandatory. It is not mandatory or socially frowned upon if you do not wear black. Um, there you don't have to wear black. Typically now people wear darker colors, but it is not socially frowned upon if you don't wear black to a funeral. If you wear white to a funeral, that's a different story, but we're not talking about that right now. But we see with today, as I was talking about with the rise of publicized funerals, with the growth of social media, mourning is no longer a private affair. It can be, of course, for people that choose to mourn privately, and that is all the power to them for keeping their own privacy. But mourning as a whole has grown from this mourning in your living room with your immediate family and maybe one friend to mourning with a community of people, to mourning with a Facebook group, or mourning through a Facebook post that you post, or a post on Instagram, or a tribute written to an article that's posted on a website. Mourning is no longer private. Mourning is something that can be used in several different ways. For example, specifically with the popular Minecraft YouTuber Technoblade. Now, Technoblade is a Minecraft YouTuber. He died in 2022. We don't know his exact date of death for obvious reasons, for privacy reasons, but his family released a video on June 30th, 2022, titled So Long Nerds, which was a goodbye from both himself, who had written a message before his death, and from his family, who was thanking his fans for all these things. And specifically, mourning was different. Mourning was no longer a private affair for this family. And of course, there were privacy aspects to this. His siblings have not spoken out about this issue. The strict communication that we get after his death is primarily from his father. But the mourning of the community as a whole was very profound. You can find still, even to this day, 3 years later, there are still accounts that periodically do tributes to him, and they post fan compilations, they post all these different things. There are many different things that people have done to commemorate this man and what he did throughout his entire life and how he brought sort of happiness to this online community. And the way that this man was honored very differently depending on who you were, but it was a general consensus that this man's life for the past couple of years had been almost completely to what he decided was documented on social media. So people went back, they watched his things that he had previously done, they made fan art, they made all these different things. And the concept of mourning was shared throughout this entire community. You could find somebody who felt the same things you did. And for a lot of these people who were in the younger teen years of their life had never experienced death on a level of somebody that close to them. Obviously, that is a parasocial relationship, but they had never experienced the death of somebody that they perceived to be so close to them. Because typically, when you're young and in your young teenage years, you may have witnessed death before, but typically it is not somebody extremely close to you. Obviously, there are exceptions to that and things do happen, but for a lot of these young teenagers, this was their first experience with death, and this was their first experience with mourning. And so for them, it was only natural to reach out to the community around them. There were mourning events. There were, well, I wouldn't say they were official funerals because obviously they weren't held in a traditional sense, but there were gatherings. There were celebrations of this man's life and all that he had done. And I think that kind of speaks to how mourning has simply changed from the times where mourning, in a sense, was only for a family and for friends. Mourning is just for friends and family and things of that nature, where mourning is a private affair and the general public doesn't know who you are. Now, in Technoblade's case, it is a different story, considering that he is arguably a celebrity, an influencer. And this mourning has just evolved in a way that I don't think that it can necessarily be controlled anymore. And with the evolution of mourning comes the evolution of these funeral practices. Now, with the rise of becoming ecologically conscious, we see this trend in death practices that become considerably more sustainable and environmentally healthy. We see a drop in burials. I believe it is predicted by 2030 that it will be around 70% cremation for the majority of things that people choose to do after death, whereas it will be around 30% burials. And this is for a multitude of reasons. Firstly, becoming ecologically conscious, and some people being like, well, I don't want to be buried in the ground, take my ashes and scatter them somewhere, or store them in like a necklace, for the family of the deceased who want to keep that loved one with them. And for another reason of simply, cemeteries are running out of space. There isn't enough space to bury the dead with a world of a population of 8 billion. Specifically in America, there are around 330 million people alive currently. And we are simply running out of space to bury these bodies. And it is hard to find a place to bury these bodies with less area to bury them. And funeral homes have acknowledged this and thus have raised their prices. Another point of why cremation is continuing to rise in popularity versus a traditional burial is cost. Before, a common funeral with a coffin and all these different amenities would be around like $5,000 to $7,000 in like the 80s and the latter half of the 20th century. But today, the average cost of a funeral with a coffin, a wake, all these different gravesite amenities like flowers, monitoring plants, making sure everything's clean, can be around $12,000. And the average American family cannot afford that cost. And it is simply easier to have a cremation, which is a fraction of that cost, typically around 5,000 ish. It is not as expensive as a 5-digit funeral. It is simply not that expensive. And because these funeral homes and businesses are raising their prices, we see a decline in the amount that exists today. We can see that from around 2018, I believe, there were around 21,000 funeral homes present in the US. And yet, by the early 2020s, around 2021, 2022, that number has dropped to around 18,000. Now, is that number still big? Oh, of course. That number is still incredibly large for an industry, but dropping 3,000, around 3,000, I didn't do the math, around 3,000 funeral homes in the span of a couple years. Obviously, part of this is due to, COVID, and despite funeral homes may being used, they may not have typical wake services anymore during that time period because people don't want to gather because of the threat of getting infected. So we see this decline in funeral homes. And continuing on from a point from earlier, we do still see this personalization that we kind of have. We see the specific wishes that people may have being carried out. Like, for example, somebody that wants to get cremated may request to their family, hey, can you scatter my ashes like off a cliff into the ocean? Can you scatter them in our backyard? Can you scatter them in my favorite park? There are these new aspects of personalization that weren't really present before in a typical burial. And the passage of time has really changed how we view mourning and how we take care of our dead. But something that has really persisted over time is the dignity that we afford our dead. And that dignity is very important, because all these people that died and the people that I'm talking about that I used as statistics and as data for this podcast were still people and they still had lives. So, yeah. I mean, I did warn you that it was going to be a darker episode today with the darker clothes. I hope you enjoyed my podcast for today. Um, Time for me to get my prescribed vitamin D. So, hope you enjoy the show. Uh, Click here or here. But have a great day. If I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.